So today we start looking at a new historical and intellectual period known as modernism. But before we do so, we should probably distinguish this term modernism or modernist from the more common term modern. In everyday language, modern just means contemporary, new, the latest thing. But the term modernism has a different, though a related meaning. It refers to a discrete historical period and intellectual movement which defined itself as the latest thing, but now is largely relegated to the past, since we're no longer in the modernist period. We're actually in the postmodernist period. We define ourselves as having coming after modernism, which sometimes seems strange to people if you think of the term modernist the way you would think of the term as modern, right? If we said we were postmodern in the common sense of the term, that would mean we are somehow after new things, and we're coming after things that are new, but that doesn't make any sense because the new is the new. But if you think of modernism as a discrete historical period with a beginning, a middle, and an end, then it makes sense to talk about postmodernism. Now I'm subtitling this presentation Things Fall Apart because it's during this modernist period that Enlightenment optimism, religion, and even culture itself seem like they're falling apart. That at least was the perception of some of the modernists. Indeed, that phrase, things fall apart, comes from a modernist poem, The Second Coming by William Butler Yeats. So, as we said, modernism is a historical period, right? And as such, we can date it, and probably the most narrow dating of modernism would take it from about 1910 to 1939. In 1910, that's the end of what's called the Edwardian period. King Edward was the king who followed Queen Victoria. He only reigned for about 10 years. And with the end of that period, we start to see the emergence of particularly artists that are looking very much like modernists, and we'll continue to talk about what that means, right? And that period of artistic experimentation sort of reaches a kind of an end point around 1939 with the start of World War II. But a more broad definition of the historical period of modernism might go back as early as the 1870s, when we're starting to see some radical critiques of the Western tradition, rejection of Western values among intellectuals and artists, people like the playwright, Norwegian playwright Heinrich Ibsen, or the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. And this reaches a kind of a culmination in the late 1890s with Freud. And that kind of radical re-examination of Western culture, in some ways, reaches its natural endpoint in 1945 with the dropping of the atom bomb, which inaugurates a completely, new set of issues for Western culture. And we can also think of modernism as a state of mind, not just a historical period. And in that respect, it's not restricted to any historical time frame, right? Just as you can be an Enlightenment philosopher in some ways today, if you are very much of the same set of same mindset as people of the Enlightenment. Today, somebody might call you Victorian if your morals are of a certain type or character. And one, theoretically at least, could consider oneself to be kind of a modernist today if one was, really concerned with radically rejecting tradition and always trying new things, right? It's kind of it's a state of mind. And, well, actually, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's define that state of mind, right? And the first thing is what I just mentioned. A radical rejection of tradition. That's what modernists do. They want to, divorce themselves from the past, free themselves from philosophic traditions, from moral traditions, and, perhaps most notably from artistic traditions. And in this way, it's a movement, it's a state of mind that embraces the new, the innovative, the experimental, right? You might remember Edmund Goss, who was writing Father and Son in 1909, which is just on the cusp of that more narrow historical period of modernism. Edmund Goss talks about how in the day that he is writing, in 1909, there is this emphasis on originality, that there's this valuing of being original, right? And that is characteristic of modernism. That's why I call it a kind of a cult of the new, right? Now, the thing is, in its early stages, modernism was fairly optimistic. It looked to a future free of artificial constraints and advanced by rapid technological progress. But with the arrival of World War I, which I'll talk about in a minute, that optimism was dampened and replaced largely with a loss of faith in human progress and in the promises of the Enlightenment for a better world, for a more utopian world. So there's a kind of rejection of the Enlightenment, faith, and progress among modernists. Now, as the Enlightenment seemed to play itself out and the world became more fragmented, ideologies were breaking down, religious ideologies, moral ideologies, culture itself seemed to be breaking down, right? The modernists did an interesting thing, What do you do when life gives you lemons? Well, you make lemonade if you're a positive person, right? What do you do when culture starts to feel increasingly fragmented and disorganized and chaotic? Well, one of the things the modernists did was they sort of embraced that fragmentation. They made it an aesthetic value. So along with the cult of the new is a kind of a cult of fragmentation, right? And you can see it even in things like Cubism, like in this work to the right. There's a kind of, delight in the fragmented that you see in modernism. Finally, one of the interesting... the roots of modernism. In some ways, modernism is the logical endpoint of the Victorian era. When Freud pointed out that it was the unconscious and not human intention that was driving culture, and when Nietzsche declared that God was dead, what was left but to, abandon, moral and religious and philosophical traditions, right? But at the same time, technology was making great strides, and we were seeing, advances in architecture and building as, new industrial materials became available. You started to have, the use of cast iron that enabled the building of these massive, tall structures like the Eiffel Tower or like skyscrapers, and automobiles were coming onto the scene. Modernists were very interested in speed and locomotion. At the start of the 20th century, the Wright brothers successfully tested an airplane, and man, it seemed like humankind was literally reaching never before reached heights. Some of these themes we've been talking about are most obvious in modern art. Some of these themes that we've been talking about are most obvious in modernist art. Picasso's break with traditional forms of representation can be seen, for example, in the painting to the left, the Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, right? This painting actually, precedes World War I. It's in 1907, and yet even then you can see a kind of a fragmentation in it. But what's perhaps most notable, right, are a couple things. One is the move away from realistic depiction of human figures, right? These women don't look realistic, and it's not because Picasso wasn't able to draw realistic figures. He chose not to, right? He's breaking with tradition. He's also experimenting with new methods, in this case, Cubism, right? And so Picasso was considered to be one of the innovators of Cubism, and this is one of the reasons this painting was valued, because it's doing something new and innovative, right? A more dramatic rejection of tradition can be seen in the work on the right, the 1917 work of Marcel Duchamp. This piece called Fountain was first displayed in 1917, and it radically changes, our notion of what art is, right? Duchamp was one of the founders of a movement known as Dada, right? And here he takes an inverted urinal and he makes it a work of art, or an objet d'art, right? this was, in some sense, a declaration of hostility, not only towards audiences, but to art himself, to art itself, right? But on the other hand, he's really asking us to look at the world in a new kind of way. He's asking his audience to find beauty in a toilet, right? And that reflects not only the break with tradition, but this embrace of experimentation and rejection of tradition opened up a gap between artist and audience, between high and low culture, and that's a gap that still exists today. And you can see that gap at work if you ever go to like a museum where they're displaying modernist works of art, like for example this Jackson Pollock on the left. And often you'll hear people say, perhaps you've said yourself, my 2-year-old could do just as well as that, right? The audience is no longer in the same place as the artist in many respects. The same kind of gap can be seen in modernist literature in works such as, for example, James Joyce's novel Ulysses. Right? In that novel, Joyce completely rejects plot and unity of form. Every single chapter is written in a different style, and each style is challenging and difficult to understand. A lot of people are not able even to finish the novel Ulysses, and those of them who do often need the help of secondary sources such as the annotated Ulysses, which you see to the right. In fact, there's been a whole industry of books written just to help people read Ulysses. And I'm not talking about like Cliff Notes or Spark Notes. From the first days when this novel was published, people were writing books about how to read and understand it, because Joyce was no longer taking his audience into consideration in the same way that earlier authors did. You can also see this same kind of attitude of the artist at work in T.S. Eliot's poem, The Wasteland. That was a poem that was so difficult and so fragmented that Eliot himself provided it with its own footnotes. Modernism didn't exactly die with the end of World War II and the explosion of the atom bomb, but something changed. We still live in a culture that rejects tradition often, embraces the new, values, sometimes even overvalues originality, right? But I guess with that rejection of tradition, we're no longer expected to reject tradition the way, for example, the modernists did. Somehow the trauma of World War II caused us to sort of perhaps also rethink this gap between high and low culture, right? We've since entered a period that's known as postmodernism. And postmodernism is marked by a greater uncertainty and playfulness than you see in modernism. And it's kind of at odds with what is often a kind of a high seriousness of modernism. And it's in the postmodernist period that we see a kind of the emergence of the kind of gallows humor that we all live with today. Postmodernism is the sort of sensibility, for example, that that juxtaposes high and low, the sublime and the ridiculous, the deadly and the comic. So that postmodernists today, we live in an age, that could, for example, find a clown face in a mushroom cloud.